Trust is the gateway to innovation in health, and too often, patients only find it by chance. We're Sciana Cohort 7, Mridul Agrawal, Raquel Correa, Judith Dios, Claudia Schade, and Andreas Welker, exploring how to rebuild trust in health communication and clinical research. Today, we're joined by Christian Roesky, a chemist by training and pharmaceutical leader at Novaliq, a German biotech company developing water-free eye drops. We are asking, how can Germany move from clinical trials as a last resort to a transparent, trusted part of patient choice, medical innovation, and everyday care?
Hello, nice of you to meet us today. Perhaps before we start, can you tell us something about what brought you into the role you hold and what is involved in this role?
My name is Christian Roesky, and I would say I'm a chemist by training. But then I got into the pharmaceutical industry already in the 90s. One is Abbott, and the other one was Alcon and Novartis. And I served for both companies as area director, corporate executive group member, and mainly responsible for countries, areas, and operations. And then I got this famous call from a friend, mentor, who said, look, there's a company that you don't know. They need you. And this was a company I'm serving now in my 10th anniversary right now. It's called Novaliq. Nova is new, Liq is liquid. And it's a company that is developing water-free eye drops. So many people say, okay, I know eye drops, but water-free eye drops, that doesn't really make sense. Actually, it makes a lot of sense. I took this opportunity and after 10 years, I can argue it's not any longer a vision. It's really working. We have approvals around the world, running only R&D. So we don't sell our products. We have license agreements in the United States, in Europe, in Germany, in China, in Australia. I can stop here around the world. And people are using our technology, and we like to stay behind the scenes as a German, private biotech company.
Thank you very much. And today our topic will be like trials and trial hesitancy. Perhaps you could describe in our country, Germany, because we have people from UK and from Switzerland in our group. How do patients typically find out about trials and how do they get into clinical trials?
Germany is one of the leading countries, running trials. Obviously, we're not as big as China and the United States, but in Europe, we have been number one. We actually has been falling short a little bit compared to other countries. And I think there are a number of factors here. So first of all, our social security system provides a full service. So patients don't expect that clinical trials provide additional value if they have a health concern, which I think is a miss in the German education system that we should do from a, let's say, education, from a health security point of view, but also from a doctor point of view. So when I go to the United States, and I'm very often in the United States, doctors know where clinical trials are running. They are very well informed. There are also platforms that are providing that kind of oversight. That is not existing in Germany. Maybe it is, but then people don't know it. And that, I think, is one of the key downsides in Germany in recruiting patients, because when you run a clinical trial, typically a center starts then thinking about where these patients are coming from. I would say if you live in Berlin, I think if you drive, the underground, there are advertisements for specific trials. So I would say in the major cities, some people already realize that you have to speak more in easy language and do advertising for clinical trials, because I think, something very valuable. And it's all about education and choices. And yeah, when people know about clinical trials, then I think the discussion is much easier for the physician and obviously for the sponsor.
Thank you. Do you know of any particular groups, genders, or cultures that engage more or less in clinical trials? Are we like missing parts of the society?
That patient with a rare disease, they have an intrinsic interest in knowing about clinical trials because there's typically no therapy there. So we know so many rare diseases that we don't have therapies for, that there are patient advocacy groups, that are really the place to go for everybody, for the physician. And obviously, we also have this in ophthalmology. When you think about the Christoffel Blind Mission, they only they not only do charity projects outside Germany, but also have a very strong or the Pigmentosa Society and so on. So I think that's very important. Cancer and eye care, I do eye care, are also established indications without rare diseases in particular, and still clinical trials are very important. And here, I think there's a huge gap in respect of seeing the value what industry can bring to healthcare, because it's both. It's one is research and innovation and changing paradigms, but it's also bringing early, under very controlled and safety regulations, early medicines to patients, expose them to this, so you can really benefit as a patient to be part of their clinical trial. Yeah.
At which point in the care pathway are trials usually discussed with patients in Germany? When do they get to know first there could be a trial for me?
In the United States, it's very different to Europe. In the United States, it's very, I would say, offensively, you could also say, discussed. In Germany, you almost have to ask for it. Right now in Germany, we have 5 sites in ophthalmology, but you can imagine there are 1,500 operating sites, for instance, in ophthalmology. So 5 from 1,500, oh, that's a small number. So it's like a lucky punch if the patient just goes to the right physician who is by accident selected for a clinical trial. So there's no, that is, I think, one of the major downsides that we are observing here. It's a little bit by chance and not by structure.
Thanks. That's a very important point. And do you also sometimes get to see to what extent are trials seen, well, as a last resort versus normal treatment? Because we had interview partners who said trials are just another treatment versus normal treatment. So we not only do the trial, but we also confirm the normal treatment. But often with patients, it's more like I'm doing a trial because everything else failed. And do you also get this feeling that that trials are seen like that?
So the expectation in Germany, driven by our social security system, is a full 100% care package. So patients expect that you get from this package your best solution. And if you touch trials, they're very much concerned. There are safety risks. Why do I need that? Is there nothing out there? Can I not take a standard therapy? So it's typically those patients that where the trial provides a last resort or an unmet medical need, which is not served by any kind of standard therapy, where trials have a good, let's say, chance to recruit faster. And I think that is really a misperception and conception by the patients, because we don't run that many phase 4 trials. Phase 4 trials are trials that are basically run after approval, and they're very important because you also want to learn about, how drugs are running in real life, because real life is so different from clinical trial settings with all the co-modifications and all the exclusions. So we run regulatory trials with obviously the higher risk because there's something novel that nobody has ever done. But I would say what I like in healthcare is we are really very highly regulated. And obviously, we are prepared for any kind of risk that is potentially associated with our drugs. And then we have rescue plans and obviously health plans. So the patient really has a 24-hour, 7-day, 365 days maintenance and support, which you don't get in any healthcare system. So yes, there are risks, but risks to anything. And I think clinical trials provide really a value in regular patients' support.
And if you look back in history, sometimes, well, for example, in our United Kingdom, there have been historical events or scandals that shape attitudes towards trials. If you look at Germany, for example, are there any historical events that you feel that they still shape the attitude towards trials?
I can see the 60s, but I'm not there yet. And my parents spoke about Contagan. Yeah. Nowadays, I would say if I would ask my children, I have two of them, if they would really respond on that. I think nowadays it got very complicated. So we talk about gene therapy. Patients are very skeptical because they don't know and understand what gene therapy can do and what kind of measures we are taking. We observed that with COVID-19, messenger RNA. So you have a lot of concerns about that. I think that's fair because people should be concerned because keeping skepticism is one of the wisest rule we have in science. And obviously, we try to convince the majority of patients. But you can imagine when you are forced to take a vaccine, like it was during COVID, then the chances of convincing your counterpart are basically fading away. So I think this kind of event is still branded in our minds around the world. And in particular, also in Germany, where we see that vaccination rates are still going down, although the value is almost undisputed in relation to the risk that obviously every vaccination also carries. Yeah. I think these are the two things. One is very close, the other very far away, but this comes to my mind immediately.
Look at the practical issues like time investment, traveling, income loss, perhaps. Do you think these are like issues for not participating in a trial?
It's obvious that time, my job is very limited, but also for patients getting older, it's not only the time, it's the effort. And I can speak out of experience. We are running trials in ophthalmology, obviously at major centers, and patients sometimes have a radius of 15 or 30 kilometers, which is not, I would say, a big deal. But we have seen patients that are coming 60 kilometers or also 100 kilometers. And I would say for rare diseases, this is much more common. And you may or may not know is in Germany, ethical committees are very skeptical in compensating for travel costs, which is actually not the case in some other jurisdictions. Not very often, these kind of expenses cannot be covered by the sponsor, at least not reasonably, which potentially adds another barrier for patients not participating or for a clinical trial maybe not enrolling the best patient because there are other factors that play a role here.
Thank you. And if you think about like public narratives about clinical research and trials, as you already mentioned with the COVID-19 pandemic, do you think they are influencing participation too? Is there much public narrative about trials?
I think it's our mistake as a pharmaceutical industry. So look, when you open the newspaper and you see, okay, these pharmaceutical companies, they make billions of dollars in revenues, but they don't speak about all the failure that maybe 1 out of 10 therapies not even making it, and they all die, and this is very expensive. And that obviously the expense also comes from clinical trials. The most expensive piece of a development is not the formulation, is not the manufacturing, it's the clinical trial. And for good reasons, because we are measuring everything, and this is very expensive, in particular to serve the patient, but also to protect the patient. I think it's a little bit of a shame we talk about cars and innovation in there, but we really don't talk about innovation, how it's evolving. It's good for ophthalmology. It's like when Lucentis was developed. Lucentis is a therapy for wet age-related macular degeneration. Yeah, basically launched in the early 2000, 2006 in Europe and then later in some other countries. And this was like a paradigm shift because before that, all these patients got either worse or stabilizing was even the exception. Now, the majority of patients retain their vision or improve their vision. So then I think there was a big hype about that. People spoke about that. This was very expensive. It was a $1,000 shot, and people were outrageous how expensive this was. But I think all the companies have missed the opportunity, and they still do talking about it. This was developed, 15 years took the development with all these clinical trials, thousands of patients and research, a lot of failure. So I think in our society, we have missed the point that innovation is not falling from the sky. It's not a brilliant guy coming up, oh, I have a good idea, it's falling down, and here it is. It's really hard work. We have not started really to explain this in more simple language so that the majority of the people understand that innovation is a hard work. It's like inventing a new car, a new engine, or a new computer. And I think some other industries are doing a much better work on that.
That's a very interesting point. I didn't have that yet in the interviews, actually. And if you look at the clinicians, how they talk about trials with the patients, are there patterns or habits in the conversation that you think help or hinder trust and participation?
When it comes to the research and to stay balanced in respect of not putting one product over the other, which I think there are good reasons for that. But there are also sometimes a little bit of hesitation in Germany to speak out what maybe a new therapy brings in respect of paradigm shift. Yeah. Typically, guidelines are appropriate for that. So some associations are doing a better job than potentially others. But yes, when you go to medical conventions, clinical trials are really a very important point. But this is close to an audience that we call specialists. Yeah. When you go to a clinical practice, you see in the United States a lot of awards and scientific things. It is now moving in Germany as well to many practices. But that peer physicians are participating in clinical trials is typically the exception. I think a good example is the University of Heidelberg. Speaks about innovation, speaks about the clinical trials he's doing in a very balanced way. So not exaggerating or sharing complicated matter, but talking about what is important, why they're participating, and that science without patients is impossible, but innovation without clinicians is also impossible. So it's really an ecosystem. And in all this ecosystem, everybody has to play his role and explain why they're doing it and where they see the value.
In our system, like in Germany, who feels responsible for making sure that patients who might benefit are at least offered trial participation? Is there someone who says, that's my job? I'm trying to get the patient into a trial?
I don't see that the sick funds are doing this, at least not in a structured way, maybe for patients with rare diseases. I think as an industry, if we are running clinical trials, and obviously there are companies that are running way more clinical trials than we do, we think that's very important. And yes, I mean, also Germany is a very good place. I just had a discussion in a different indication, dermatology, and there are us and cooperating with sites in North Rhine-Westphalia, in Düsseldorf, and in Cologne, very actively in phase 1 and obviously further clinical trials. This is typically outside the academic centers. And I think that's now what I observe in Europe, which is a similar trend that I see in other jurisdictions. People thought in the past all these clinical trials are being done in academic sites. Actually, that has changed. We also see this in the United Kingdom, that now professional private sites running with very high ethical standards and obviously on high tech have understood that innovation is important and you can only run something really good if you focus. And here is the issue with academic sites and hospitals. That's not their focus. Their focus is patient care, their focus is research, share, and this is obviously education for the next students. But many countries have added a fourth pillar, and the fourth pillar is you can make money by running clinical trials. This can be very ethically, but this should be perceived as an income, not as an expense. And if that would be settled further in the German, let's say, healthcare ecosystem, I think there would be a value to everybody because we have enough controls in place that these trials don't run just for the money, but these are profit centers, while many of the other, let's say, pillars maybe are centers of expenses. Yeah.
And my last question would be, if you could change whatever you liked and it would happen, um, what would you change in the system to get more people into trials and that more trial participation would be possible?
Yeah, I would make available trials visible to the right audience and would not request, but hope that physicians put this in their patient, discussion about therapeutic choices. Because in the end, it needs to be a discussion on eye level. The patient is not any longer the person who comes there and say, "Dear doctor, what do you say? I will simply do what you're telling me." This was a time of my mother. Nowadays, the patient is very well educated. People are complaining about that. They say these ChatGPT patients, but I think they underestimate that you also have to respond to that, and maybe you need to be better educated. So I wish there would be more transparency in education and actually a more positive perception on the physician side. And yes, we would have an infrastructure that requires to make these trials transparent so that lays and also the community knows what's going on. And then it's the choice of the patient and the physician in their private and protected relationship if that is an option or not. In many cases, it's not an option.
Thank you very much for joining me today. It was a real pleasure. Is there anything else you want to add at the moment?
What I would like to really highlight is, first of all, thank you for really talking about this matter because you said what needs to change. We need to talk about that. And I think you took here an effort to really put this on the agenda in a very, yeah, I would say scientific and not this kind of we need this, we need that. Because look, this is complicated. There will be no quick fix. But I think in a country like Germany, we should be at the forefront of innovation because that's likely the best we have, no? The smart brains and the smart people. And that can provide value to so many people, even beyond Germany, obviously, yeah, because medicine is not fixed to borders. Yeah.